Okay, hi everybody. This is Nick Klosky, and I welcome you to the November 2015 Kickstarter Mesh Mixer webinar, or the webinar for the Mesh Mixer Kickstarter, or whatever we want to call it. I welcome you. We have really good turnout today, and as always, I would like to invite you to ask questions in the little chat box on the side of this webinar. I really want to make sure that that people get the information that they need, and so I would much, as I've said in previous webinars, much rather answer your questions than talk about the things that I have set up to show you today. With that said, I didn't get any survey responses this time, so I am just going to be going over some of the things that I wanted to kind of talk about that I've found within the last month or so that I think would be useful for you. But please go into the little chat box and ask questions while I turn off my phone here so that it doesn't beep again there. Again, I want to say that Mesh Mixer is a great program. I still use it every day in my 3D printing workflow. As you know, Honeypoint 3D is a rapid prototyping and education company. So we want to train people as much as we can to do the CAD design work for 3D printing. But a lot of people don't want to learn all of the ins and outs about CAD design to actually make products, so then the other side of our business will actually do it for them. But this part of our business is about educating you. So I want to make sure that again, I ask you to ask any questions that you want in the little chat feature right out there. I see that we already have 20 or so people on the webinar, which is great. So with that said, please ask your questions, but I will go into what I'm going to talk about today on the webinar right now. First things first, Mesh Mixer has updated itself a couple times since the last webinar, but if you go onto the Mesh Mixer website or the forums, there's no real substantive changes. They're just what are called bug fixes, so we don't really know what has gone on, just very small changes. So if you see an update to Mesh Mixer, you can download it, but you won't see any major changes. The previous changes were kind of major with using the make solid command and transferring colors over, and we talked about in the last webinar. So with that, let's kind of go into Mesh Mixer and talk about some of the things that I have been seeing and working with over the last month. And again, if you have any questions, please ask them in the chat function. So let me go in. Well, first of all, I found myself wanting to create something that I saw on the internet. It was actually a kind of a candle holder for the holidays, and so I wanted to figure out how to make my own candle holder that I could 3D print. So again, if you've taken the Mesh Mixer class on Udemy, there's a whole section about when you would want to use a more mechanical program and when you would want to use Mesh Mixer. And this is a really great example for when you would choose to use a mechanical program and then bring the output of that into Mesh Mixer. In this case, I found there was a specific diameter of candle out in the world that I wanted to put in this object that I was making. I did some research and found that it was a certain number of millimeters in diameter. And so Mesh Mixer is good for creating, actually it's not that good for creating things of absolute accuracy. You can kind of approximate it with a couple of the tools, and I'll show you that in the next section. But if you want things that are more editable and things where you can just literally type in 6 millimeters or 10 millimeters, Mesh Mixer is not really the tool for you. So I'll show you a very simple thing that I did in the CAD program that I recommend, which is Fusion 360 from Autodesk, which is free, and when to bring that into Mesh Mixer. So let's jump into Fusion 360, and I'll show you very quickly what I did with the candle holder, and then we'll go into Mesh Mixer from there. So I will go and click on this and share my Fusion 360 screen after a moment here. Screen 1, share. I will go into Infinity here, but I will bring up Fusion 360. So this is a small candle holder that I made. We'll rotate around it. We'll see underneath it. And if you look at this, it's actually a very, very simple shape. If I roll the little timeline back here at the bottom, back to the beginning, we start with nothing. I created the initial shape of the candle. So this is a positive, but this will turn into a cutting tool later. But I wanted to make sure that I had the bottom of the candle modeled, because that is the one absolute piece that I need in order to have the candle work. Obviously, the candle needs to fit in there. So then the next step was I created a form in the sculpting environment. So this is this kind of pillowy kind of box cube thing with a rounded bottom. And if I actually go into here and say edit form, you can see it has some symmetry. I could change the sides if I wanted to by editing the form, kind of popping these out, making them different sizes. But the reason why I created that cylinder first is you can see the cylinder inside of here. I can make whatever change I want as long as it doesn't cut into that cylinder. So if I make it really, really pinched inside of here, you start to see, you can kind of see maybe over here, the side of the cylinder is now outside of this. That still technically could work because up here would hold the candle, but generally I want to make it something like this so that the candle is completely enclosed inside. So I'm going to just undo that to go back to where I was here and cancel this out and say finish form. So that was the second thing that I did, right? Create this. And I created this kind of pillowy bottom down here because I'm going to be embedding this into my object later on. If this were totally flat, it would be much, much harder for me to embed it. And you'll see why in a little bit. So I kind of pooched it out a little bit, and you'll see why later. And then the third step down here is the, it's called a combine, but the combine is just either combining or cutting. So I use the combine function, which is under modify here, under combine, to cut the cylinder out. So a very simple shape. I'm left up here with one body called body 2. I right click on that and say save as STL. You can say, I'll move this over here. Format binary is fine. Refinement, I usually just select high for everything. And then if you just click OK, it'll ask you the name of the STL. Or if you have Mesh Mixer installed, you can click on this little button and send it directly into Mesh Mixer. But I'm not going to do that right now. I've already saved the file to my hard drive. So I'm going to close this out here. And it will come back, and we will probably go back into Infinity, and I will switch back. Here, I will stop sharing. So that is the first part. The cylinder, I didn't really show that, but the cylinder, when I created it, I just said it was a diameter of, 6 or 7 or 8 millimeters and of a certain height. I could just go in and double click on that measurement and change it to 7 millimeters or 8 millimeters. Very, very easy to change. Mesh Mixer is not that easy to change, which is why I did it in Fusion. And then I can go back and edit that at any time and re-export it out. That's just how I do it. You certainly could do it in Mesh Mixer, and I'll kind of show that to you coming up, but it's much, much harder to go back in and change things. For example, if you got it a little bit wrong, if you need to make it 7 centimeters instead of 6, it's a little bit harder to do. So let me go back and share my screen again. We will disappear into Infinity, and I will bring up Mesh Mixer. So this is the default bunny that you get when you start, or you can go to File, to Import Bunny to get the default bunny. As of the last update to Mesh Mixer, I covered this in the previous webinar. If you look underneath and you have the correct shader on here. The inside faces of this are now striped, which is a little bit easier to tell that these are inside faces when it's striped like that. So that was a nice little addition that they did. And the reason why I saw that was on any other shader, like, you know, any of these cool shaders that might be like really fun for you to use, or, you know, dramatically lit like this, it doesn't give a determination of inside faces and outside faces. So it's really good to just go with kind of the boring shader up here, which is the second one over. The boring shader actually gives you a lot of good information about inside and outside faces, and face groups and all of that. So I'm going to go to Analysis to Inspector and just say Repair All. Quick little thing to put a bottom on the bunny. So great. So let's go back. I said that I would show you how to create an accurate size something in Meshmixer. There are a few ways of doing that. If you go in and import you know, different things, I can go in here to Meshmix. There are some cylinders and all of that you can bring in. So this, even though it may not look like a cylinder, it is, if you drop it on the bunny, it will attach to the surface, but if you drop it outside, it will create a cylinder outside. And you can set the size of the cylinder. So if you want to set this to 6 millimeters, right here it says uniform scaling, so all of these change to 6. You can say accept. And I'm going to click T for transform to just kind of move this over by the bunny in the 2 directions. So you certainly can get a 6 millimeter object like that. And I'm going to go up here to View to show Objects Browser. So we have 2 different objects in here, the bunny that we started with and Mesh 015. I'm going to double click on that and say, change this to 6 mm cylinder, just to rename it, make it a little bit easier to work with. So you certainly could go in and transform that. And again, this is the trick that I showed in the Meshmixer videos online. If you want to align things in 3D space, let me kind of show you what this looks like. You know, you can align it down here, and you say, okay, it's cutting out of the bunny, but then you look to the side and it's nowhere near the bunny at all. So the great way to do this is to go from one angle, align it to where you want, like right there, and turn around 90 degrees and go, okay, now I'm going to align it right here. And then just for good sake, you can go on top and say, okay, I'm going to use this alignment and put it right there. And then click accept. That was hitting the T for transform. So now I could run a Boolean on this, you know, maybe. Again, remember in Meshmixer, it really wants meshes of the same density. So if I hover my mouse and push C right here, I center on that. If we zoom in, this is somewhat the same density. These are pretty large triangles. These are pretty large in one dimension. If we click on these and do a Boolean difference, actually this shows me, you want to click on your object first and your cutting tool second. I'm holding down the Shift key and do a Boolean difference. It kind of cut through. When we click accept, that actually worked pretty well because the meshes were of the same density. So now we have a 6 millimeter hole cut in the object. So that's great. That totally works. But if I want to go back in and change this to 7 millimeters, I would have to, you know, undo these. I could try to undo these. Now that I have a 6 millimeter cylinder, I would have to hit the T key for transform. And I could try to scale this up. Actually, I could just type it in here to 7 millimeters and click accept. So that does work. But it only works for this. If you do any sort of sculpting on this at all, or you change it even a little bit, and you try to run a transform on it, you now get some weird numbers up here, and it starts to get very messy. So contrast this with the way that I was going to do it. I'm just going to import a new bunny and replace it to kind of start over. Run the inspector to repair it. Great. and hit W to turn wireframe off for the moment. So I'm going to click on import. And instead of replacing it, I'm going to append, go to my desktop here, and find the little candle holder. So it came in underneath here. I'm going to click the T for transform and move this. And it came in rotated, so I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees. And remember, if you rotate inside or outside, you move, at 66.96 degrees. It's very hard to get it. If your mouse touches those little hash marks, it snaps to the hash marks, or outside, you get very fine movements. Now, sometimes you want to go outside. I'm kind of going off on a tangent here. But if you move inside of here and you want to get it really precise, it's actually kind of big jumps. A trick is to move your mouse all the way out here, and you can get very, very precise movements because it's farther away from the pivot point if you need to get very precise movements. But I don't. I'm going to go on these hash marks and move it to 90 degrees and click accept. So I know that this is the proper shape. I'm going to hit the T key for transform, move this right into the back of my bunny like this, back of the bunny here, kind of do it on top. And that's great. I'm going to click accept. Now this way, I already have the negative part cut out, but I have this really nice positive on the outside. So I could just Boolean these together and call it a day. Well, not, right? Because if you look inside, if we click on this bunny to activate it, the bunny's back is inside of this hole. So I've had some people in my own personal life ask, how do you get rid of that material? So some people might say, oh, smoothing would do it. But really the best way is the draw tool. And that's what I want to focus on for this part of the example. If we go in here to sculpt, we have two different types of draw. We have under this volume slider here, so there's volume and surface up here in the top left. Under volume, we have draw. So if we click on that, it raises up. If we click on surface and switch the little toggle here, we have draw, draw 2, draw 3, and draw max. So if we just do draw under surface, it does a similar thing, but this only affects the surface. So this is, you can kind of think of these as two different ways. This is, if we click on volume and we do draw between these two ears, the two ears will kind of come towards each other. If we make this a lot bigger, and even a lot bigger like this, you can, well, let me turn refinement on here. You can see that turn this up here. The draw tool is actually affecting all of these because I'm in a volume brush. A lot of times when you want to do things with this, like the surface, you don't really want to affect the entire volume underneath. You just want to affect the surface on top. If there happen to be very complex things going on underneath, this bubble goes deep into the model. So it's better to go switch to surface to a draw command like this, which is only affecting that one side of the ears. And you can kind of see the disc of this brush rotating on this. So let's go into this. If we click on the draw command, I'm going to make this smaller, and click on this, we are adding material, and we don't want that. So we want to hold down the control key. I'm going to turn down the strength. You pretty much never want to use strength of 100 unless you want to make really, really big things. And I have flow turned on, which means as long as I hold down the mouse key, the operation will keep going. But if you're doing this with a low strength, the flow is a little bit more manageable. So I'm going to be holding down the control key. I believe it's a command key on Mac. And draw works in the opposite way. I'm actually getting rid of material. Make sure also that you have refinement turned on. Otherwise, you'll get a lot of very crunched triangles in here. And also, I have the bunny selected, so I'm not affecting this candle holder at all. So I have control clicked or control held down while I'm clicking, and I'm just kind of clicking around this, and it's going down, it's going down, it's going down. You might think, you know, the candle is still going to be popped up, but if I keep doing this and I keep kind of moving it around and massaging it down and down, I'll zoom in a little bit, massaging it down and down, I'm kind of going around it right here. I can even keep my mouse pushed down on this, so I'm just still clicking on my mouse. It's going down, and now you see something happening. So this is the bottom of the candle holder, and now as I hold down the control button, drawing in reverse is essentially getting rid of material. I'm going around and getting rid of material. I can make I'm pressing the left bracket to make my brush a little bit smaller. So remember, in Mesh Mixer, the power of your tool is based on the size of the brush. So right now, if my brush is really, really large, you can see that it's very, very large. The tool acts kind of slowly. But if I make my brush smaller, that power is now concentrated in a smaller area, and it goes a little bit faster. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger and turn up my strength just to show you. I'm going to hold down Control again and just start massaging this away. And I'm going to turn up the strength a little bit more, turn up the reduction a little bit so I'm not creating so many triangles. If reduction is all the way down, what that means is that I'm not really reducing all of that much, or the refinement gets turned down, just goes a little bit slower. So I'm going to keep refinement turned on with a good amount of reduction. You know, smoothing can be wherever you want. And I'm going to just massage all of this away. Now, with a large brush like this, you may end up massaging too much. But so now there is a little, let's zoom in here, little tiny bit right there. Get rid of that. So now I'm going to look on the sides, make sure I didn't massage too much away on the sides. I didn't. If I did massage too much, I'm still working on the bunny. So I'm clicking with the Control key. You don't see anything happening, but you go down here, I'm actually doing things to the inside of the bunny. If you prefer, when you're doing work like this, you can go click on this X-ray shader and drag the X-ray on, and you can kind of see too. When I held my click button down, and I said it wasn't really doing anything, it was doing a lot of stuff. It was going all the way down there. I couldn't see it because it was not on the skin of the bunny, but I was doing quite a bit. So I'm going to undo that. And you can kind of just, you don't really want to use this all the time, but you can see a lot more with this. You see I did a little bit of Booleans or a little bit of reduction, too much underneath here. But all I'm really caring about, which I'll go back to my other shader, is that there's no bunny inside of this candle. So now I'm going to click on, I have the bunny clicked. I'm going to hold down Shift, click on the candle, and do a Boolean union. So it kind of shows, that there's a cut right here, but that's okay because it'll kind of close that cut up later. Click Accept. Mesh Mixer will think about it for a second and create a nice edge. So now you see we have one object with that candle holder beautifully in the bottom. Now, if I wanted to, I could go in with I'll go back to the volume to maybe a robust smoothing tool, again with the strength right down here near the middle, and start smoothing this in. I can turn, not so much reduction down. See, now with the reduction down, I don't get these big triangles. I'm keeping these small ones inside of here. And I just kind of go around and make that boundary a little bit more nice. Move this out of the way. So the boundary is now a little bit more nice. Now, again, this is a separate color because it's a different face group. When you Boolean things in, they come in as face groups. It's not an actual color. If you're not seeing color, again, remember, hold down your space bar and make sure that the color mode is this one. Again, when you hold down the space button, anything that is dark is enabled. So I have free movement enabled right now. I'm looking at the mesh normals, and this is the face group. This one is not enabled because it is still light colored. If I clicked on this, my color would disappear because now I'm looking at the actual color that would be assigned to the vertex groups for like 3D printing and color. But I really don't want that when I'm working inside of Mesh Mixer. So I'm going to hold down the space button, make this one dark, and the face group is there. If you don't like this face group, you can always do a Control A to select everything. And you're going to go up here to modify, which is modifying the selection, and say clear face group. Now that color is gone. So I'm going to go back to the Hangout here and stop screen sharing and come back. So hopefully that was a good example of when you would use a more mechanical structure and bring it into Mesh Mixer and kind of modify it that way. I don't see anybody that asked any questions on the chat, but I would encourage you to if you have any questions. The other thing I wanted to go into today was a little bit about creating some unique things with patterns. The pattern tool is one of the most flashy tools in all of Mesh Mixer, but it's also kind of complex to use. But I want to show you a way that you can use patterns to create base geometry to do other things. So I don't see any questions there. I'll kind of go back and forth just to make sure that nobody is asking any questions. But I wanted to show you a very kind of simple thing you can do to create a really awesome shape. So let me go back and screen share back into Mesh Mixer, off into infinity, and there we go. So I'm going to go in here and import a sphere and replace it. So we just have a sphere, normal sphere. If you press W, it's just a smooth one. W again to get the wireframe. So that's great. So here's a really cool trick that actually people use for jewelry. You know, obviously you would want to hit the T key and make sure that you're using this in the right size, right? So something that would be the size of a pendant or something. So this looks like 24 millimeters, 2.4 centimeters. Not that large. You might want to, make this larger. You can do that now or you can do it later. It doesn't really matter because when you're modeling inside of Mesh Mixer, size really doesn't matter. So you can make something that looks really, really nice and then later on change the size. So it doesn't really matter, but it's just something to consider if you want to work with something that is appropriately sized to start with. But anyway, let's go in here to edit to plane cut. So plane cut, if you just accept it, will cut things. So right now I've made a dome, right? A half sphere. Can be very useful in its own right, but that's not what I want to do. I want to go, I just hit the undo key, which brings me back into plane cut. So what I want to do is go to, instead of cut, I'm going to slice. So what slice does is it just cuts a line through, but it doesn't discard the other side. But right here with the type of fill, so delete refine will actually create a half sphere here, a half sphere here with two sides that are absolutely 100% touching. That's not what I want. So I'm going to go here to slice with no fill. Oh, actually, I'm not doing that. I'm sorry. I want to go to slice groups. So what this will do is this will go and create a group on one side and a group on the other, but I don't want to delete it and then add in. I just want no fill. So what that'll do is it'll create a group on one side and a group on the other, but if we go in and let's say select some of this and delete it, it's still just an empty sphere. You can see that inside, so I'm going to undo that. But we're going to do that a few different times. I cut that in half. I'm going to go back into Edit to Plane Cut, and I can just draw a line where I want it to go. I'm going to do the same thing, slice groups with no fill. Except, so now we have that group there. I'm going to do that a couple more times. Go back into Edit to Plane Cut, maybe one on this side, change it to slice groups with no fill. and then do maybe one more plane cut, let's say right here. You can also then edit the plane like this with the little manipulator in different directions if you want. And I'm going to go to slice groups, no fill. So what I've done is I've segmented this into a whole bunch of different groups. Now I could certainly go into something like sculpt to draw, and with filters say restrict to group, make my brush bigger, and then only sculpt on that one group. Totally valid. You can see that I'm only sculpting on that one group. None of the other groups are being affected. But that's not what I'm going to do. I want to go in to edit to make pattern. So there's lots and lots of different options with this. This is kind of the preview of the tools you're going to be using, because some of these are very computationally intensive. So it gives you a preview of the tool. If you click on update, it'll actually show you what will happen. But you see, it can actually take a long time for some of these things to run. So that's why it gives you a preview instead of the actual tool. But what we want to do in this example is go up here to the top menu and go to face group borders. And you start to see some really cool things happening. So I'm going to cancel out of this. Well, first of all, zoom in a little bit. You can see there's kind of a nexus here with lines coming out of it, kind of radiating out. If I cancel out of this tool, you can see that this is the nexus here. There's these lines coming out of this. So anywhere where one face group borders another face group is where this tool will happen. So you can see this purple to this green to the blue. When we go into make pattern with face group borders, that is what we get. And again, this is a preview, so you get these little bars. You can say the different dimensions. You can make these, very, very thick, very super thin, like this. If you're doing this for 3D printing, as an example, if you wanted to 3D print this in metal, you would go on to a company like Shapeways, and Shapeways would say that they cannot print any wires like this that are under, let's say, I don't know the exact number, 1.8 millimeters. So you would say, okay, well, if Shapeways needs 2 millimeters, let's go and just click on this and make this 2. I click that and press enter. So now, as long as I don't shrink anything, this is all printable by Shapeways in metal. You can play around with other things. The spacing doesn't really do much in face group borders. The smoothing happens afterwards. And the mesh resolution is, how dense you want your mesh later. Gradient, you can do a gradient like this, where the gradient starts and where it ends, right? But if you're wanting to print with Shapeways, this gradient will affect where, it's kind of a cool effect. This gradient, and you can kind of see here, this gradient will affect your printability with Shapeways because you're changing the size. So we're just going to say no gradient, and we click accept. Mesh Mixer thinks about it for a second and gives you this super awesome object that should be printable by Shapeways. Now, of course, these are called unsupported wires because they're very, very thin. And then if you want this polished, Shapeways, may have a problem with that. They may want it to be a little bit thicker to survive the polishing process. And even then, Shapeways is not going to be able to polish the inside of these. You'd have to go to a much more expensive process like the plated metals to get the inside of this polished. Just like a normal polished steel, they don't spend that much time polishing those. So the outside would be polished probably right along the edges, but the inside would not be. But this is a super duper awesome shape that you get very, very easily with those face group borders. And then this is a 3D model. You can go in, if you really wanted to, you could mesh mix, little bears or, other, this bear is far, far, far too big. But you could put, different little mesh mix things on them if you wanted. It's just a mesh like any other. The nice thing about the make pattern command is that you don't lose your original object. So it's still here. The little eyeball in the object browser gets turned off. And remember, if you don't see the object browser, go up here to view, to show objects browser, and it's right here. So the little eyeball is turned off. If I click on this, I will see where it is, but because the eyeball is turned off, it's only a little ghost, but I can turn the eyeball on and see the sphere. But the sphere is still there, so I could Boolean this back on. I can go, well, I could do a couple things. I could go and hold down the Shift button, select both of these, and say Boolean union. MeshMixer will think about it, and now I have one object. Once, you know, this is a lot of stitching that MeshMixer needs to do right here. And unfortunately, MeshMixer doesn't give you kind of a wait message when you do a Boolean union. So right there, it was just waiting, but now it is one object. I could go in with maybe a robust smoothing tool and start, well, it's a little bit too big right there, and start smoothing. Turn this on and start smoothing these out. Maybe not the robust smooth, but a shrink or bubble smooth. Actually, what I would probably do is a bubble smooth. Go over here. Bubble smooth in, but I would do a control for, oops, and my filter is still on, so I'm not going to restrict a group. So now that'll work. A bubble smooth out would do it really well. Remember, if you hold down control, it'll do a bubble smooth inwards. So it's kind of carving inwards with that. You can kind of see that I carved a ditch with that, but that's not really what I want with this. I would want to do a bubble smooth outwards, just a normal bubble smooth like this. And my strength is too much on this. I would probably turn this down to make a more graceful smoothing. But there's that. I'm going to undo all of those until I get back to two objects. And again, I'm going to click cancel. So these are two objects. I can go and say, I want the sphere. I want to use this. If we go to the X-ray, we see that this shape is embedded inside of that sphere, right? Because, let me go back. If I turn the sphere off, it is a thick sphere that goes inside. So what I can do is I can click on my object first, click down here on the pattern, and do a Boolean difference. MeshMixer will think about it, and it has cut those channels out of that sphere. Super awesome. Or if I click on Boolean intersection, we get only where that object intersected with the sphere. So the outside of it is smooth, and the inside, essentially, you've cut this in half. This is where it intersected with the sphere. If you go back in, you can do things to the sphere. If I transform this and use this little white dot in the center, this little cube, and click and drag on that, I can make the sphere smaller or larger. So now I'm having it just barely touch this outside. I'm going to click on the sphere, click on the pattern, and do a Boolean intersection. And now we're going to get a much different result. So remember, it was only barely touching. I might want to make that sphere, go back to the sphere, make it a little bit larger so that it's touching a little bit more. And now I will do a Boolean intersection, and I'll get a little bit more. So that's a little bit nicer, so a thinner cut. So that is a lot of different cool things you can do with the Make Pattern tool. Let me go back to make sure there's no questions and stop sharing. So that's kind of one example of what to do with the Make Pattern tool. There's lots of different things. I would really invite you to go into the section on the online class and look at the Make Pattern tool. There's a lot of different options on that, and they don't really act like you think. There are some where it says you want to intersect or subtract, and they don't really act the way that you think that they would. So I would really suggest you go in there. It's kind of complex to do it. Also, I want to make sure that in every webinar that I do, that I plug the MeshMixer forum. There's some users on there that are really, really good at responding to people's questions about MeshMixer, about just how do I do things. And it's a really, really excellent resource. Really, there's a couple of people on there, MagWeb and RMS, who is the author of MeshMixer. They really, really do look at that forums and answer people's questions. So if you do have questions, go there and they will help you. I've never seen them not answer a question that is kind of like people looking for help on how to do things. So if anybody has any questions, again, on anything with MeshMixer, I would invite you to ask them in the chat. And kind of the last thing that I wanted to talk about, I will go back into MeshMixer here, share this, and just start again. We get a couple of questions actually kind of recurring that we talked about in the previous webinar, but I really, really want to make sure that this is down for people. You know, people say, well, how do I create initial geometry with MeshMixer? And then they get into problems with it. So in the last webinar, this is kind of a corollary to what I talked about. I'm going to import a plane and replace it. Get rid of the objects browser here. So even with a plane, something like this, you can get initial geometry really easily. A stamp is a great way of doing that. You know, remember, you can define whatever stamps you want. You know, if you selected something like this, you know, drew something like the letter S that I just did, and maybe make, you know, a little serif sonnet or a little snake or something like that. Even this, you can go in and say, once in the select tool, convert to stamp. And this will give you a preview of what the stamp will be. It's that easy to make a stamp. So I'm going to do that. This is kind of like a little river, or a snake, or an S. Click accept. Great. So what actually happened? I'm going to clear the selection right here. We go into stamp, and now we see right here our little S. So I'm going to click once on that. And now I'm going to click and drag on this plane. And you'll start seeing that MeshMixer does whatever it needs to do to create that S. So it's creating geometry. And you see on the right-hand side over here where my mouse is going, how big in millimeters that S is right now. So that could be of helpful to you or not. But what this does is, once I let go, it doesn't do anything to the plane. It's still here. But what it did is it added geometry to create a face group here. So now if I go into the select tool, it's usually a good practice to make your brush fit within the face group. Double click on this to select the face group. Or if you don't want to do that, you can go in, just click somewhere inside of the face group like this, go to modify, and expand to groups, which is the shortcut G key. So you've selected the face group, and you can go up to edit the selection and do something like extrude it. You can drag it right here, and we're extruding that out or down. So let me extrude it up a little bit and accept it. And now I'm going to clear the selection, just kind of get back. And you see it's created a face group on the side, this amber color, a face group on the top, this purple color. And now you can go into sculpting tools. I'll do robust smooth. So robust smooth, what it does is it kind of balances the smoothing between all densities inside of the cursor. What this does is, if I've made this very large, it's taking the smoothing that you would need for this very loose and balancing it with the smoothing that you would need for this, so that you get a nice smoothing effect. You see, it kind of does a different thing, the different size brush that you use, because with this brush, the densities are what they are inside of this brush. But if you make it larger, it has to take into account the densities everywhere. and the densities outside, you know, in this area are very loose. So it tries to kind of match the densities here. That's kind of, I generally try to use that because it's a good smoothing tool, whereas the other smoothing tools like bubble and shrink really do change the mesh quite a bit. You can also go into surface. The smoothing here also does it, but I generally try to start with the robust smooth. So what I'm going to do in here is refinement, do a bit of reduction, and just kind of very, very quickly go around. You know, there's different ways of doing this. You could also do this more programmatically with, well, actually, I can kind of show you how to do smoothing the other way, because I've already shown you how to do it with the sculpt tool. Undo all of this. So this was a really nice feature done in the last update. When you go into select, right here, we've always had crease angle, but geodesic distance is, actually, it doesn't really apply to this, but geodesic distance allows you to go in and, let's say, go like this. And it says, you see right-click drag. Right-click drag doesn't really do anything on if you're using the default movement controls. So if you see right-click drag, you say, oh, okay, right-click drag, you know, it doesn't, I am right-clicking and I'm dragging. You have to hold down the control key in order to do that. So that should actually be control right-click drag. If you were using up here under preferences, the navigation mode mesh mixer, then that would work as it says. But most people use the 123D apps. So in this case, you have to do control right-click drag, and it actually starts expanding out ring by ring, which is kind of nice. It's a new way of selecting. And you see, as I'm expanding out, this is roughly equal to this, which we didn't have before. We just had go out by one triangle. So when it went out by one here, it would go out by one here. And that's a really, really small area. And that's a really, really large area. But now with this geodesic distance, you can actually get roughly equivalent areas. Very cool. But anyway, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm going out here with the crease angle. And you know, if you go like this, it doesn't really do anything. But crease angle, I'm going to turn it very, very far up. So I'm only selecting the bottom now. I'm not selecting any of the sides at all. And I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. And now I'm not selecting any of the bottom here. So you can be very, very selective for what parts you do and don't select. So now that we have a little bit over there selected, actually, let me just do an example of this area right here. You can go in to do some things like smoothing tools. There's no real draggers on this. To make it easier, you have to you know, start typing in different values. But you can do, just go back in here. You can start to do different smoothing techniques with this. It's not as easy to do, but you can do kind of global smoothing with the deform tools. Soft Transform 2 allows you to do kind of some changes there. You can start to do a stretchy transition of the fall off, right? So you can start to do some smoothing with these tools, but generally, you know, smoothing your entire image like that, I would stick with the sculpting tools. But anyway, so you've gotten a really nice base image right here to start doing things with. The problem is that you started with a plane and you have back faces underneath. So if you go to 3D print this, it just won't work. But the very easy way to do this is, if this is the shape that you want, this kind of S snake shape, you just go into Edit, to Plane Cut, and you cut off just the very, very bottom. And I'm just going to click Accept, and it is there, and now you're able to work around with this shape. Now, one thing with the Plane Cut tool, if it's off even a little bit like this, and we click Accept, you're still going to get the same effect. Because it needs to go, it needs to cut an absolute complete outline. You see the preview here, it shows we're creating a new face group of solid triangles here. As I move this, I'm going to tilt it a bit right here. Now you see the preview. There's no solid thing because right here, our angle has prevented a complete outline from being cut. So the plane cut command isn't going to work as you think it was. You would have to move this up, up, up until finally, boom, you get an outline there. And I cut it, but I didn't cut it enough to get rid of this. So that preview really, really does show you when you're cutting appropriately for the plane cut tool. So let me go back to stop sharing and go back to here. So those are some suggestions on how to do things, especially the thing that I talked about in the first would make a great holiday gift, right? We're coming up for holiday time. The inspiration that I got for that was something. Let me just share my screen here and share that and open up a new tab. Oh shoot, what was it? I think it was called a Menorah-saurus. One of my friends on Facebook is Jewish, and they wanted to create a little menorah. These are done by an artist on Etsy, where I think they melted old toys and made these. So these are not done by 3D printing, but something like this. It was super cute. But I was able to go find a Tyrannosaurus Rex model online, and then model all of these little candle holders on it. And then other people have done other things. An elephant, a lobster, which is really funny because lobsters aren't kosher. That's kind of funny. All sorts of different things, and that is a super easy thing to do in Mesh Mixer, and would be a great idea for for the holidays, is just to find some model online. It could be of anything. A good place to go is TurboSquid. TurboSquid, turbosquid.com, and find some of their free models. And you're not going to sell it because those models are usually licensed in a way that you're not going to be able to download things and sell them. But for personal use, you can go download an airplane or a Tyrannosaurus and just put little things on top of it to make a candle holder. Or whatever. It's a very, very good kind of tip for the upcoming holiday season. And so I did get a question, actually, now in our last few minutes. Does Blender work with Mesh Mixer? So certainly, there is a course. Let me share my screen again here and go back to this. So there is a course, Blender for 3D printing. And I will get into that in a second. Blender for printing course. Here we go. So this is made by the Blender Institute. I actually have this when I was first learning 3D printing a few years ago. I took this course and it was actually kind of useful. It's 27 euros, so $35, $40, something like that. Quite a bit of information. There's actually a few hours of information on there, and it talks about how you can use Blender for 3D printing. Now, if we go in, and then you kind of saw me do the search before, when I did this Blender for 3D printing, there is a 3D printing toolbox inside of Blender. So if I'm still sharing my screen here, I'm not sure why Blender is not coming up as a default. Hopefully I have it installed. If not, then this will install it in a second. Blender, so bear with me while Blender installs. Blender certainly can do 3D printing. It's nothing like Mesh Mixer because Mesh Mixer has tools for creating overhangs. So here we go, Blender. If you want Blender for 3D printing, you would go up here to File, to User Preferences. So under here in this little search box, let me move this to the center right here. Under this little search box, type in print, and it says 3D Print Toolbox. Make sure that there is a little check next to 3D Print Toolbox. So when you close Blender, you now have different options. You know, there's the object tools, rigid body tools, but now there's Print 3D. What it does is it allows you to calculate the volume of it, calculate the area of it, you know, solid checks, intersections. We can expand this out a little bit. You know, do some thickness checking, all of that. It does have some kind of not rudimentary tools. People use it. And let me go back to showing me as a video here. People certainly do use Blender for 3D printing, but Mesh Mixer is designed to bridge between the digital and physical world. If you're interested, that 27 euros goes directly to the Blender Foundation. So that's an awesome support because Blender is a fabulous tool. And you certainly can do quite a bit in Blender with thickness analysis and all of that, but you can also do all of that in Mesh Mixer and more. Of course, if you want to add in UV textures, if you want to start doing any animations, Mesh Mixer can't do any of that. But Blender certainly you know, holds its own for basic 3D printing tools. If you want more advanced, you use Mesh Mixer, but then if you want, you know, animations and all of that, you would use Blender. There you go. So no reason to apologize, Jack. I'm happy to show people because a lot of these webinars are also viewed after the fact. I want to just make sure that people have the information. So I really appreciate you asking that question. So we're right at the top of the hour. I hope you had a good viewing. Please send me emails or make sure to fill out the surveys when I send out the next webinar invitation, because I really want to base these webinars on the things that you care about. And it could be general questions about how do you do 3D printing in schools? How do you even start teaching Mesh Mixer in a school? How do you use Mesh Mixer professionally? How do you work Mesh Mixer into a workflow? Or just general 3D printing things. You know, I'm pretty expert on 3D printing. I have my 3D printer right there. It's not running right now, but it often is. And so I'm more than happy to answer questions about that as well. So I will sign off. Thank you so much. Have a great holiday if you're here in the US or if you're worldwide. Just have a good week, and I will see you later. Thank you.